Yeah, this today is intended for a broad audience, although a lot of the stuff I'm going to present is about devices. You can easily expand that to diagnostics, combination products, and to a somewhat lesser degree, maybe to therapeutics, although the post-approval pathway is very, very similar for all the products that ULP gives such a fruitful roof over their emerging businesses. Oh, I'm trying to move now and it doesn't. What do I do wrong? Ah, here we do. So I've divided my presentation into pre-approval and post-approval life cycle factors. You can read for yourself. I'm not a very good reader of slides unless I want to highlight something in a slide. I'm pretty sure that ULP will make available this presentation to those that care to ask for it. I'm working right now as the medical director of Emergo, the largest medical device and diagnostics consultancy in the world with 26 countries. I'm teaching at USC, International Regulatory Affairs, and I'm a standing member of the advisory committee to the European Commission for classification of devices. So let's start. Many good ideas are killed in the bud by not being patented. They are invented, not a problem, but you need, I don't know, I see myself, but I don't want to see myself. I want to see the whole screen. I don't know how to do that. Anyway, so you have to ask yourself when you have invented or you have an idea or a very early concept, these are the three really critical questions that every company, young company in the life sciences area must ask itself. Who want to pay for your device? You can have a phenomenal idea. A few days ago, someone came up from Israel with a phenomenal idea. I was really dumbfounded by it, but it involved something, and I can't tell you right now what it is, obviously, where I said, well, it's great, but why would someone pay for this? There has to be an incentive, and it's sometimes a mixed incentive because it may be good for the patient, but then if you do, say, a very early detection of, let's take a cancer, lung cancer, um, the insurance company might not be that interested because now they're going to have to pay much longer for many more patients. So it's really important to clear that pathway early on. Then what are you patenting? Are you patenting, and we'll get to that in a little bit, just the proper device or drug or application, or are you patenting something more narrow like the manufacturing patent? It's really important to make a lot of thoughts, and you need to go to a solid experienced patent attorney office and ask for someone who is able to understand your product and its ramifications and implications. So are you patenting just the design or the use or application as well? Really, really important. Also, where are you going to patent? Are you going to patent in the US? Are you going to patent in China? Are you going to patent globally? Costs go up exponentially, but on the other hand, so does your protection. And patent protection is becoming more and more complicated as there are more and more inventions that border on each other or even overlap. So the next thing is you're in talks with your patent attorney, and now the big questions start to roll in. The single most important one that FDA will ask very early on, if and when you meet with them, but the same is true to a lesser degree with notified body, and it is also very true for insurance companies, payers. What medical need will you product meet? Is it just something that's nice to have when the world will continue to turn on without it? Or is it a showstopper? Is it something that really is important that will impact healthcare, like a surgeon does surgery for a cancer, and during the surgery, your invention is able to detect whether cancerous tissue is still in the patient or not. That could be a game changer. So someone wants to pay for that, and the insurance would want to pay for that. Why? Because that prevents a reoperation and it might prevent late complication. Very important to define what does your product do, how does it do, and will you have the data to prove that desired indication and claims. If you don't have the data, which is mostly the case, how are you going to close that gap? You will need to do probably, if it's possible, animal studies, human studies, big studies, small studies, epidemiological studies, so much that you may or may have to do, and it's very important to find that out early on. Is it a novel use of an existing product? A totally novel design. The more novel you use the word novel and innovative, the more regulatory agencies are going to be on your neck. If you say this is new, nobody has ever done it, then FDA will say, well, that's great that you tell us, so now come with the data. If you say this is an improvement of an existing surgical method, they will say, fine, do a comparative study and come back to us with some data, and you won't have a rough ride. You won't have a rough ride, but you also will not get a lot of bigger money than the existing product. So there is a trade-off there, and you will need an expert to take your young company or your young product by the hand and say, this is what the balance between the natural urge to call this innovative and novel and the cautionary approach in the regulatory sense, where you say, yeah, it's an improvement, but we know the materials. The materials have been on the market for a long time, and it's better, but it's not that much better. It takes an effort to say that, but you will have a regulatory benefit of that. And by the way, when we are halfway, I'll ask Karen to see whether we have urgent questions. So here are three more points. Are competing products available? Even though your product might be novel, there might be products that do similar achievements, and now you have to compete with those products because the reimbursement, the payer will say, well, you want to have $5,000, but there is a product on the market which is $1,000, and you better explain to us why your product is more expensive and why we should pay that higher price. Some countries in the world will be easier than others to get into. So it pays off to make a plan, a worldwide strategy plan. Sometimes low threshold countries look very attractive, but there's a reason that they are low threshold. Either there is a bad reimbursement, or there's pretty much a copy and produce mentality. There are all kinds of dangers that we partially will encounter during this presentation. So have that phrasing, your indication. Your indication is more critical than I can emphasize in this presentation. Have it vetted by an independent expert or medical consultant who will tell you what the ramifications are. Give you two examples. Say your product says, will prevent lung cancer. Well, you can see that is such a monumental, huge claim, nobody will make that claim. Or it could say helps the early detection of lung cancer. That's a very different approach. Yes, it may help or it may not help. You still will have to do a big clinical study to figure out whether your claim is true, but at least it's doable. And you will not waste a lot of money and time by chasing a pie in the sky. So get someone, get maybe a small team even to vet that phrasing. Okay, now you have a preliminary final phrasing, you have your patent, and now the designers are turning loose on the product and make it into something which they love. That's fine, as long as what they love is what the market loves. If the designers turn into tinkerers and say, well, we can improve this a little bit, that might make it more user friendly, and then they keep going to do that, there will be a point at which the product would be magnificent, but your money is gone. And in this case, and this is a multiple experience, personal experience, you can say the best is the enemy of the good. And sometimes you have to say, this is model one. This is model one. We're going to get approval and we're going to market with model one. And then the designers can work in the meantime and in parallel on model two, but that's not what we're going to pursue now. And you might, in the meantime, and we'll see that later, have teamed up with a large party in the market, an established company who says, well, you may think this is the design, but that's not what we think it is. So then the design process is severely impacted by that partnership. Segregate the research, the R from the D of development. I've seen companies going under literally because management didn't follow this golden rule. Do not unnecessarily postpone a feasibility test. Most feasibility tests, certainly for truly innovative products, need to be done early. Why? Because if you postpone it, you may have gotten well into a design of something that doesn't work, and you've spent a lot of time and money in vain. So everything must be documented. I cannot overstate the importance of documentation, including the documentation of your failures. There are FDA and notified bodies and the Australian TGA and Canadian Health and so forth and so on, all will say, well, we see a prototype or we see a late stage developed product. How did you get there? What was the pathway between the sudden middle of the night wake up of the inventor and said, I got it, and the thing I see on the table or I see in the lab? That documentation pathway is critically important. And you have also to guard it like Fort Knox, because people will wish to understand what solutions you found to the challenges in design. But that's your IP, your intellectual property. Well, let's assume you're well on your way. Now the time has come for another worldwide exercise called benefit risk management. Um, you made a medical claim, you meet a medical need, but there are very few products that come without a risk. There are a few, but not many. Let's take that example that I gave a moment ago about surgical detection of the margins of clean tissue and cancerous tissue. The risk obviously is that the sensitivity isn't high enough, and the surgeon thinks it is clean and it is not. That's not good for the patient. The opposite, you cut out too much, mostly is not that terrible. Unless we're dealing with the brain, then it could be, um, at least for most people, it could make a difference. So I forgive my pun. The you can see that there is a risk-benefit ratio and balance, and that needs to be phrased in a very clear and unambiguous way. Most countries have an approval system where the level of data and the intensity and extent of data is proportional to the risk level of the product. Sometimes it's logical, most times it's logical, sometimes it's not, but that is what it is. And it's a living document. If the product is used in many patients, new risks will be uncovered. That's logical. It's not bad at all, but they need to be documented and factored into the benefit risk management. And sometimes products have been on the market for a long time and that was never done. And that is coming to these so-called legacy products, which you're not, you're in a different category, but those companies have a lot of trouble because they never gathered data when they should have done that. This statement involves external independent medical expert. An independent medical expert is someone that is not a shareholder, has no vested interest in whatever outcome, can be paid for the effort, of course, but is not, whether the outcome is good or bad, doesn't make a difference to that expert. And this is another point where a lot of companies could use some help. Clinical studies, I will go through that fairly quickly, not because it's not important. It is important. It's the single most expensive and time-gating component of the pre-market pathway, but because it's so different for different products that it really doesn't pay off to go into much detail. I know these days very few products, and there really would be me too products or copies of existing products where maybe clinical studies are not required. Even an ordinary 510K, a substantial equivalence to a marketed product in the US, will usually demand or require clinical data, if only uh, to allow doctors to determine that it is in practice indeed equivalent to a pre-existing product. Um, Very important, before you uh, even talk to a CRO, a clinical research organization, make sure there is a buy-in by the regulatory authorities, because otherwise you might spend a lot of time and money for nothing. And do assume if the study is budgeted for 2 million, it most certainly will end up between 2.5 and 3 million. That's a fact of life, whether we like it or not. Those points speak for themselves. Get an independent medical expert, obtain counsel for regulatory suitability, see whether the data can be used for other purposes, and make sure, by the way, that those purposes do not cross road into your primary goal. So if the primary goal is regulatory and the secondary goal is reimbursement, then those two should not, they may intersect, but they shouldn't replace the priorities. And then see whether, this is most importantly for Europe and Australia, whether a proactive post-market surveillance and other regulatory regimens will be necessary. Why is that? Because these cost money. They're not free of charge. So if you have a business plan, those costs have to be factored in. And the more complicated and long-lived the product is, let's say a hip implant, you can easily imagine you have to follow the hip implant for 10, 15, 20 years. That's a cost. And it can become a high cost. So it's important to factor that into the business plan and into the price. So this speaks all for themselves. to the third point, I've seen many situations where the inventor said, oh, I have such a good friend at the Hammersmith Hospital in London, or McGill in, where is it, in Montreal. We can run the study there. Yes, you can run the study there, but maybe it will be disastrous to do so if you didn't find out whether those centers were suitable for the study. So let's say you would need a study population of at least 300 suitable patients a year to have a reasonable time of completion for the study. And your big friend at the Hammersmith say, oh, I can do 20, I see 20 a year. Now you have a problem because that center, although as much as the guy may be motivated, he cannot possibly complete the study. So this is why an independent vetting agency like consulting, like we do that ourselves, but you can also take someone else. You define what you need, and then that independent agency will go to your friend at the Hammersmith and say, oh, you're a fantastic doctor, but we need a bigger clinic. And it's then the outside agency who has given the bad news, and you stay friends with them. Many small things. Good. Let's assume that's all starting to be on the rails. Manufacturing, if you don't manufacture, you don't have a product. If you don't have a product, well, that's the end of that game. Make sure that you guard your supplier selection and control like the core of your business. I've seen many so-called due diligences where a prospective partner said, well, you know, we cannot talk until we have seen your supplier list. You know what? Then don't talk. Guard it. Keep it. Because that is what you found out with all the blood and sweat and midnight sessions where you have to source your components from, your specs, and you're not going to give that away unless someone is seriously paying for that, or become a serious, and I mean serious, partner. So here come the designers again, the tinkerers, and say, you know, we have this sterilization method, and let's say it's gamma sterilization. But we found a factory in northern Oklahoma who will do beta sterilization for half the price. Well, you know, if you do that in the midst of your study, you invalidate your study. If you do that in the midst of your submission, you invalidate your submission. That is a major change, and you don't want to do major changes after you have frozen the design. We have seen, in my practice, I've seen too many companies going under totally unnecessarily because they changed the design after design freeze, and design includes sterilization, packaging, claims for shelf life, what have you. And I know the drug people will say, oh, what is this, MDSEP, etc. It is a similar quality system to GMP. It's not that different, actually. And any changes, and that goes for those products as well, can have major repercussions. Don't do it. That's the only thing I want to say. Once you're done, you're done. There has to be a very valid reason to change your supplier or manufacturing site. Briefly, excuse me, this is not COVID. It's thirst. Regulatory approvals. US has a very well-known staged approach, no controls, hardly ever happening these days. 510K, a lot, but less and less, because FDA becomes more discerning about those. A lot of de novos, and de novo means that there is no good predicate for the device. But on the other hand, the device is no more risky, or that's at least what the company claims. And obviously, that calls for solid clinical data. And then you have the top level, the pre-market approval application, which can be between 500,000 and 2 million, and that is a very major endeavor. FDA doesn't like those. They are no more than 50 a year, and they consume about 60% of their resources. So they're not very happy about them, but sometimes it's unavoidable. IDE, non-significant, those are all regulatory schedules that a good consultant can tell you about upfront before you go to a so-called pre-submission meeting. And I would say that 90%, 90% of new products, even if they're not that novel, do benefit from a pre-submission meeting with the FDA. It's a lot of work. I mean, altogether, if I would monetize it, it's about $15,000. You have to make a 50-page submission package. You have to rehearse. You have to sit with the FDA. You have to chew over the results. It's a lot of work, but now you know where you are. If you can't afford that, or if you're too early, you go to DICE, Division of Industry and Consumer, I believe, Evaluation or something like that. I don't know what the E for stands for. Anyway, you can go there, call them up literally, and you get a very nice old lady with a reassuring voice who tells you in that same reassuring voice that she cannot do really a lot for you, but if you send a short paper, she will get an answer. And that's what they do. Education, that's it, not evaluation. It's very useful. It's free of charge. And I would urge anyone in a very young company to ask the questions that you want. However, as with any question, your answer will be as good as your question. So if you don't ask a clear question, then you will not get a clear answer. And it does not preempt the later pre-submission meeting, but what it does is it makes that meeting more efficient because you know what to ask and what to present. And one of the things, and I repeat that here for a good reason, how much is your product actually medically needed? Because we have seen a lot of products, probably, I've seen many of them for a fact, that are nice to have. They're not bad, but did the world wait for it? Not really. So you might have to redefine, in all honesty, how much that the need is going to be there, and that has a lot of repercussions for the business plan. Well, I already said, meeting with FDA, you prepare. You have a big team on your side, on our side, the non-FDA side, to make notes. 3-4 people make notes. FDA makes notes, expect notes from you, and then there is the final notes. And the final notes, unfortunately, are that. They are final. So if you said my product is orange, suddenly 3 years later you come back and say, well, it turns out to be green, you better have a justification for it. And that obviously is facetious because the color is mostly insignificant, but anything that you change from that meeting, you better better justify that. There are fast track medical approval, there's breakthrough or not, there's humanitarian use device exemptions, etc., etc., etc. A lot to talk about, which I could talk a day about it and still wouldn't be finished. EU. The most important thing for American inventors is to understand that the EU system has nothing to do with the US system. In almost every sense, and as you are probably all aware, it has changed. There is now medical device regulations which will kick in on May the 26th, 2021. Oh, I'm running out of time. Gee. Um, the yeah. So it's
Yeah, time out. Yep. You
oh,
still
I
got
did.
25 minutes. Yep.
Okay. So this is a very important to understand what the regulatory status is in Europe versus the FDA, which may determine which route you want to go first. Standards, the bottom bullet. US is only lately starting to use standards in earnest. They have a list of standards which are worldwide, including the US, accepted, mostly ISO standards. Europe is far more focused on standards, also European standards, which sometimes are standalone in the sense that the US doesn't necessarily recognize them. It's very important when you design a product to use standards, document why you use them, document why you do not use certain aspects of standards. Really important to do that and have your designer or designers uh, go into great detail. So it is the CE marking is not an approval, it's a statement of compliance with essential requirements. There are more than 17 notified bodies these days to choose from, but not all of them will cover your product. Uh, Especially where software is involved, the regulatory hurdles have lately increased enormously. And contrary to the US, which has a good and well defined risk benefit approach in terms of software, Europe is more of a zero based approach where every software will be judged onto its own merit, which is a lot harder to establish. But even when your product would um, be a candidate to go to Europe, talk to us and we'll try to help you figure out what is good for you. Time to market in the EU these days tend to be longer. It used to be different 5 years ago, but it depends on the class. A pre-market approval application is still longer than anything else in the world. And it also depends on how well versed you are with the systems. Here are the core factors in CE marking: correct classification. Of course, we start with the intended use and indication statement. You can read this for yourself. Once the CE marking is there, there is a near global recognition, and that's an interesting asset. Lots of other jurisdictions in the world: Japan, China, Latin America, Brazil. Lately, we have not seen a lot of increase, but the players, the current players, are all getting more experienced and less flexible. India, notably, India is a huge country, huge market, very, very difficult in a bureaucratic sense. Um, you have to have someone on the ground there to know what the latest rules and regulations are. I mean, Emergo has in most of these countries a foot on the ground or boots on the ground, um, but it pays off to know upfront before you start doing any submission what the logical sequence in terms of cash flow and return on investment would be in terms of sequence of these countries. Well, post approval. You got the approval. Now you're going to start and sell. Here are the factors, and we'll go through them quickly. First of all, of course, your product is shipped, let's say, from the US. Now it gets somewhere and it has to be imported. Well, in the US, the importer has some obligations, so has the distributor. It's not very complicated. But in Europe, the four economic operators, the manufacturer, the importer, distributor, and authorized representative, all have their defined responsibilities in the medical device regulations. And it's important to have these ducks in a solid row even before you start manufacturing the product, um, let's say immediately post approval or even prior to approval if you want to have some storage, some product in storage. Define your criteria. Here it says for distributor, but these days also for the importer, and then start a selection no later than your foreseeable approval date is known. Because if you wait, the product is sitting and you won't have cash flow. Consider external support with local knowledge. If you want to sell in South Africa, in Malaysia, in Brazil, you need someone on the ground there. And don't think I can do that. My brother was in Brazil for 3 years. He will do it. He will not do it because he doesn't have a clue how it works. Think when you contract with someone, always about the exit. May sound strange, but until a few years ago, if you had a distributor in Japan, the distributor owned the product approval. So when you wanted to get rid of the distributor, you also got rid of your approval. Not a good thing to do. So it is very, very important these days. That has changed, but it's always important to once you have a distributor, to have a contract which allows you for an honorable and business-wise exit. Authorized in the representation Europe, it's a bit specialized, I would say. Talk to one of the established guys and get the information. I don't want to dwell on those now. Importer is different. Importer in Europe is different from distributor, and distributors usually don't want to deal with importation because it's a lot of documentation and compliance, and they surely don't want to deal with authorized representation under the new MDR because it has a lot of liability. They want to distribute, period. Importers want to import, that's it. And define who in your contract, who will bear the cost of compliance and changes. Try to ensure that enforcement of the compliance is possible. It's very nice to have someone in Argentina and says, yeah, I will do that. Turns out he doesn't do any traceability. You lost track of your product. Now you have to do a recall. Who's going to pay for that? You, if you didn't put it in the contract. So make sure that everything is well defined. And again, get an external reviewer, not just for the legal aspects, but also for the regulatory compliance aspects. New, as of today, is the UK authorized representative because of their great Brexit, and perhaps in a few months, the Swixit, Switzerland leaving the EU. That will probably be a temporary matter, but still it might happen. And in that case, the Swiss will need an authorized representative outside Switzerland and vice versa. The exporters from the US and Europe will need one inside Switzerland. No details known. When you cross that bridge, call me and I'll tell you what I know, which is not a lot right now. The bottom line speaks for itself. Liability, always a big thing in the US. Liability for a defective product ultimately always lies with the manufacturer. So in other words, a defective product, even though a country might go after the local distributor will go back to the manufacturer and said, how would I know that this product wasn't sterile? Well, how would he know? So there is a very important contractual stipulation, and your distributor must be open to audits of his documentation, and always make sure that your forward traceability to the end consumer is well established, because you cannot do traceability from here in a country like Chile, Argentina, Malaysia. You mention any of these countries, you're not going to do it. It's not possible. So if the distributor locally screws up, the impact may be regional or even global. Therefore, have that exit, have the liability, have the compliance clauses carefully phrased. Post-market compliance, a whole laundry list of things that need to be taken care of. And in fact, all these points apply, and I have bad news for you. It's going to increase in the future because the US is looking into a more rigid post-market follow-up, which is called here real life data for certain products, notably implants and high-risk products. So it pays off to watch the FDA website and see what they come up with. But it's going to happen. The good news is that the US will accept European data and Europe will accept US data. Lots of points, certainly not exhaustive, this one. We have seen this one. You want a high price. Well, what reason do you have for that high price? I remember the days of the early drug-eluting stents, and all the guys said, oh, yeah. A normal Bayer stent is $1,500 and ours is now $3,000. The insurance would say, or the hospitals would say, why is that? Well, the vessels do not clot as easily. That's great. That's fine. So we don't have a re-op so soon. Will the patient live longer? We have no idea as a manufacturer. So you have to have your ducks in a row. Sometimes you can, sometimes you cannot, but think it through, please. And if the local reimbursement scheme is very specialized, you don't want to do it yourself. You want to have specialists to look that up for you. In the US, it's all organized and centralized, but in Europe, it's not. And we work with a company called Mediclever. There is even a local contact that I have here, Ari Shen, and they are specialized. They don't do anything else but pricing and reimbursement. You can call them up if you need support there. Emergo doesn't do that. That's one of the few things we absolutely don't do at this time. Maybe in future, but not now. And it's very important for you to know, because if your business plan says we are going to sell this for $750 a piece, and the Mediclever guy says, listen, guys, you can think that, but you're not going to get more than 425 one in Germany and maybe 700 in the US. That does impact the valuation of your company and your business plan. We talked about this, iterative designs, exit strategies. Very briefly, 5 minutes. Sorry. Get bought. A dream come true. When? Well, when the valuation is good. Fine. When is the valuation good? How? Big company who will dictate, well, we don't like your this and we don't like your that. Why don't you make a new iteration? And you make the new iteration and they still will say, well, it's not what it ought to be. And before you know, you have become their development lab free of charge. That's not a good thing to do. Small company, they will probably not do that so much, but they may not have the means. Or give a license, but then what and to whom and what's the impact on the IP and so forth and so on. Or continue and grow forever. Now, when you do your exit, is there an exit to the exit? Mostly not. Mostly not, and if it is, it's not a very pleasant path. So, I'm pretty sure that most of the audience is familiar with the program Shark Tank. If you swim with big sharks in a tank, that has its risk, unless you're a shark yourself and you're bigger than the rest, then that's fine. Otherwise, here are a number of things, scenarios that might happen, and I all lived through those, all of them. Even the bottom one, when Boston Scientific, this is long ago that I can say it, bought Schneider catheters this was 15 years ago. They had they bought a brand new factory, closed it within a week, and reopened it in 2 weeks when they got onto Swiss television as a national scandal. So that wasn't a very clever move, but they perceived the product as a threat to be destroyed. Ensure your patents are well covered. Guard your IP. I think I've said it 5 times now, but do. Design changes must not exceed patent parameters, another thing where you have to keep check on your designers. If the suitor wants design changes, make sure he pays for them. There is no such thing as a free lunch. Put limits everywhere when you're in negotiations. This negotiation has gone on for 9 months. Well, you know what? That's not a negotiation. That's a sucking your bones dry effort. Have a plan B or C, even C not to lose prejudice. See, this is what Confucius said. And even if he didn't say it, he should have said it. Did you do your homework? Here's the homework. Will your money last? The sixth bullet. Will your money last if things go south or take longer than projected? A lot of companies said, oh, we have done a mezzanine, now we have done a Series C, we're about to do a Series D. There's only so many letters in the alphabet. When you refinance and refinance and finance, there comes a moment where new money givers are no longer interested, and that's a bad situation. So these are the single most important failure factors. You can read those, but I want to try to, the bottom and the top one are the most important. Management. With bad management, the fate of the company is sealed, regardless of how good the product is. And too much trust at the wrong time and with the wrong party, I should have said. Thank you.
Thanks, Jaap. I do have a question. A great resource on Medical Device. Actually, we've had several of our startups actually work with Ari Shen and his group. So thank you for including that in this presentation. But we often get asked, this. I think this is a very common question. But at what stage of development should startups really start thinking about reimbursement?
Well, I think this should be very early because it impacts the business plan. So let's say a company has a new hip. That's not facetious. It happens all the time. And the new hip is easier to implant. Let's put it that way. And because it's easier to implant, the surgery time goes down from what is normally 50 to 55 minutes to 35 minutes. That's 20 more minutes, 20 less minutes. And if you do 6 surgeries a day, that's 1 more surgery. That is big money for the orthopedic surgeon. Now you tell the insurance that for that particular reason, the hip is not the usual, let's say 3,000 for a total hip, but it is 8,000. You will have to build that argument very, very early on. And maybe it's not realistic. So this is why I'm saying, if you have a particular amount in your business plan, the time to vet the reality is pretty early on. And there may be different prices. The 8,000 may hold in Japan, but it may not hold in Germany. And it may not even feasible in, say, Algeria. I'm making completely up these countries, obviously, but it's clear that the level of cost may differ in different countries, and that will in turn impact the profitability.
Great, thank you. If anybody in the audience has questions, we have about just a couple minutes left. Now, I know there's some changes coming down the pipeline for labeling. Do you have any thoughts about that? How companies should plan?
Labeling.
Mm-hmm.
Labeling is not in the US so much, I would say, but in Europe, yes, because the MDR, which is not a very well written regulation, stipulates that you must have your importer in the label, you must have your authorized representative in the label, and you must have your manufacturer in the label. And if you have a separate distributor, I think that also has to go somewhere. So it's a lot of addresses, although sometimes let's say you can combine the importer and the authorized representative, and then that would be one address. If there is a change in label because, let's say, a catheter has been used less than 30 days, and it turns out that most users use the catheter for 60, 90, or even longer days, then that implies a labeling change. It's a higher risk. It's a different risk. The risk needs to be evaluated and the label needs to be changed. So that's for Europe. And the latter thing is for most, for most countries, I would say.
Great. Well, I want to be cognizant of everybody's time. So thank you, Jaap, for joining us today. I know we're going to be doing some subsequent programming as we're discussing. So everybody will be getting a survey after this webinar. So please, if there's any ideas or questions that you have, please put it in our survey. We give away a free gift card every month for survey participants. Also, if you're ever interested in any ongoing events, the ULP website events tab always has not only our events, but regional events that are relevant to the life science and med tech industry. So in the meantime, I know these are challenging times. I want to thank you all for joining us virtual. We're really looking forward to getting back in person and just crossing our fingers. I know, Jaap, you already got your first round of vaccine.
I did, and next week my second. And
Fantastic.
now I read that there is a mutant 484 that is not covered by the vaccine. So I don't know.
I'll wait for the booster then.
Hopefully.
But thank you all for attending. And if there's anything you need, please reach out to me in any way. And thanks for joining us. Take care now. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jaap.